On a car ride home, while thinking about how my students impact my life, I ask myself, how do I impact them? The question provides itself obvious answers. I teach them, I provide them instruction, and from time to time, I act as a confidant. But is this all I am to them? A provider of facts and instruction? Is this the greatest impact I will have on my students? I found myself hoping that I would have an impact that would shake them to the core, and that I would be that teacher that they look back and said, he changed my life. Lately, I felt that I haven't been living up to the potential my students deserve. So as I drove around, taking the long way home, I pondered, how could I do that? How could I be that teacher? It came to me with an eighth of a tank of gas left. I only had to decide what would be the one lesson that would change their lives. What would be the lecture that would leave them in awe? And what would I tell them if this was my last lecture? The Last Lecture is a book written by a computer science professor named Randy Pausch, who was asked to partake in a series of lectures where people would treat it as if it was their final talk. However, for Pausch, it was close to home as he had been diagnosed with terminal cancer and would pass not long after his talk. His book talks about the lessons he learned after finding out that he was going to die and the lessons he wishes his children would learn. The Last Lecture series is an attempt for us to really focus on what is important and what wisdom we want to impart on our listeners. For me, I thought maybe I should talk about the preservation of art and its importance to society. I thought I should tell you to prepare for the workforce before reality is upon you. Maybe I should discuss the dangers of emergent technologies. None of these topics, while all important, seemed quite important enough. While pulling into my driveway, it dawned on me. The one topic that touched me enough that it would be fitting to be my final speaking point to the people I have the privilege of calling my students. I was born in North Carolina, but I tell everyone I'm from Maine. My family was raised there, and ultimately it would be the place I would spend the majority of my youth. But while I called it home, I was considered an outsider. I was the southern kid who had just enough family ties to the small community to make me a member, but I was always looked at like a half-breed. I would be reminded every so often, you're not one of us. Despite all of that, life was pretty good. My elementary years, I spent socializing with the popular kids and being part of the in crowd, as if 10-year-olds have an in crowd. I had good grades, and overall, I was the ideal kid with an ideal home and an ideal community. Then came middle school. Middle school would be where life became a little bit more treacherous. I was a hefty kid, and I was always big for my size, but when puberty came along, it didn't help the issue. While kids began playing sports, I stayed inside and hid away in my fantasy books, attempting to escape reality. I was still a well-rounded and well-liked guy. The only person who really seemed to have an issue with me was me. I recall standing in the bathroom, staring at the mirror as I got ready for school, and walking through the long list of things I hated. My eyes, my cheeks, my arms, my gut. As these inspections became longer and longer, I found myself liking myself less and less. I am gay. I stood in the mirror one morning, quiet, reserved, and hesitant as I whispered those words. While many believe this is the most liberating of moments, I simply found it as more ammo for my self-hatred. Now I could hate my height, hate my large feet, hate my voice, and now I could hate a very piece of my soul. But because of the suicide of my neighbor, I had discovered a method I could extract revenge upon myself. Kids then were just as cruel as they are today, and don't let anyone tell you differently. I remember being called fat, chubby, and being the last picked in gym, unless it was dodgeball, because then I made a good shield. But unlike the bullying before, I had an ace up my sleeve. Unlike before, I had a method in which I could escape. My days were spent with the smug satisfaction that any moment I could decide to kill myself. And while I was picked on, I contemplated how I might do it. If I would name names in my note, and would I force them to live with the guilt? It was only a matter of time before I made fantasy a reality. I began to walk a very dangerous line. Things changed my freshman year of high school. Having dealt with a life of depression, abuse, and neglect, my mother attempted to kill herself. Up to this point, the idea of death had been vengeful, alluring, and perhaps even romantic. As my father shouted to call 911 and my mother lay sobbing in her bed, I was scared into thinking differently. Watching my mother in the hospital, covered in wires and tubes, and being told that she might never be allowed to come home again, there was nothing alluring. This was only compounded when I went home alone that night to find my mother's journal detailing the decline of her emotional well-being. And all this time, I was unaware. I sat there in her bed, the notebook sitting next to me, reminding me of the disaster that was my family. Each page detailed her struggle, and with each word, I watched as the inevitable reality approached. I became mad. I wanted to be mad at her, but like any child, I felt the responsibility was all mine. For all the years that she had felt this pain, I realized I had never simply asked my mother, "How are you?" My mother's suicide attempt was unknowingly an intervention. While I would spend the next 4 years hating her for it, her tragedy was my salvation. I was forced to stand in the bathroom and look in the mirror and ask myself, how could she have done that? And while talking to the ugly homo in the mirror, I knew. It was the first time I apologized to the kid I had hated for so long. I wish I could say my story ended there. While I was healing, looking in the mirror and practicing my smile and learning to compliment myself, I decided it was finally time to test drive my self-worth. I felt my heart pound as I told my dearest friend that I was gay. I didn't realize I was holding my breath as she told me that she didn't care. She gave me a hug and she told me that she loved me for me. It was the first time I had ever heard that. Loving me for me. It's a novel concept. Being naive and unaware of the bigotry sheltered in my hometown, I must have told somebody whose definition of secret was different from mine. As I walked down the solitary hall of my school, it was obvious that I was the topic of interest, and I already knew what was being whispered. It was only confirmed when a teacher confronted me with the rumors. I wanted to lie and deny it. I wanted to keep this new discovery private, but I always came back to my best friend's honest, loving, and life-changing words. If she could appreciate who I was, I owed it to myself to do the same. I told my teacher it wasn't a rumor, and I said it with conviction for the first time. My mother had spent so much of her life hiding how she felt and hating herself that I knew I couldn't repeat her mistakes. I began to love me for me. It was only because I had been forced to grow up at an early age and deal with issues that no kid should have to face that I had the personal fortitude to make myself an unmovable force. However, at the slight bit of self-confidence, the insults began to cut deeper. I was no longer the chubby kid. I was the homo, the queer, and the faggot. Somehow, despite their ignorant name-calling, I found comfort in knowing I was being true to myself, and it gave me the ability to ignore them. Knowing now that bigotry is born out of fear, I can understand why they hated me. I was different, and I was beginning to find comfort in my differences. I would get into scuffles and even a few fights. The small group of boys who attempted to make my life hell would attempt to whittle away at my self-confidence. Years later, I would discover that one of them was quite similar to me. And he used his hate to hide amongst his peers. He would confess his guilt, and with a simple thank you, we found mutual respect for one another. Much like this boy, I'm aware that not all of you are quite there yet. This is where I have a proposition for each and every one of you. No. This is where I have a proposition for each and every one of us. For those of us who are staring in the mirror, uncertain of who we are, and for those of us who question our self-worth, we need to learn to smile at that awkward individual staring at you in the eye. Accept that they're not so bad. You need to learn to love yourself, and the first step is accepting who you really are. We need to love every aspect of ourselves, and when we find something we dislike, we have to admit that we are not perfect. It's not always going to be easy. We'll have days when it's impossible to see past our own worst enemies. When this happens, we need to learn to ask for help. We feel this ache in our hearts and this burden on our shoulders. We have to realize we are not alone. We have to believe that the people we rely on will share this burden. We need to have faith that they will, without judgment, accept us for who we are. And when we find ones who do not, inevitably we will. We have to have the courage to move forward, find the people who understand just how wonderful we are. Even if it feels like we have nobody to turn to, we have to know we are not alone. Some of you were born pre-packaged with self-confidence. You've been able to face adversity with determination, and like a shield, you wield the knowledge of how awesome you really are. For the brave and sure of self, I have a very different challenge. Share your confidence. Not all of us have the ability to reach out and ask for a friend in our time of need. Be willing to be the friend who lends the shoulder to cry on, but more so, be willing to be the stranger that offers a helping hand to those who have nobody else to turn to. Do not take your good heart for granted, and do not assume that people can see the exceptional traits about you. Act on it. Look to the person next to you and realize, for all your differences, you are together in this struggle we call life. When you see your fellow human in need, answer the call and open yourself to them. Let it begin with the simplest of words. How are you? And to those hurting, realize that we empathize with you because we too have had those struggles. I think back, what if that boy had peers in his life that had stopped to ask him if he was okay? What if they had stopped to engage him in a conversation in which he realized that he was not alone? I wonder, what if through the years people had stopped to check in with my mother? Would it have reached such a negative climax? I wonder, what if we were simply good to one another? As I thought about what would be my final message to my students, one message kept whispering in my ear. If this was my last opportunity to distill wisdom in you, I would simply say, be good to one another.